Hello, my name's Simone and I'm a counselling psychologist, and I want to ask you how you cope under relational stress. Our relationships are very important to us, so knowing how we cope under stress gives us some idea as to the type of coping strategy we have. And how we cope under stress will drive us into particular roles in relationships. So there are two main ways that we cope. One is internaliser and the other is externaliser. Now, I am an internaliser. And internalisers under relational stress will tend to ask themselves, what have I done? They'll just take all that distress inside. And by characteristic, internalisers tend to be highly empathic, very conscientious. They tend to be hypervigilant. I learned as a kid in my home to just be quite watchful and either get out the way or solve something. I was like the family therapist very early. Yes, I have monetised my trauma, essentially. But under stress, internalisers will tend to become quite self-blaming. They will become anxious. They'll be very preoccupied with fixing things. And the role they sort of fall into in relationships is like the relationship manager. And this means that over time they become more accommodating. But they tend to sort of become smaller in the relationship. They take up less stress. And the problem isn't that there's a lack of insight or understanding. In fact, there's probably too much understanding that's doing the heavy lifting to tell the internaliser that the relationship is better than it actually is, because they don't want to grieve losses, essentially. The problem is over-responsibility. So not enough self-direction, not enough limits. Internalisers tend to pair up with externalisers, and externalisers, and there is no shame here, I'm not privileging one above the other, I'm just saying what they are. Externalisers tend to be asking themselves the question, what have you done under relational stress? So whereas internalisers direct the distress in, externalisers thrust it out. And externalisers by characteristic tend to be much more assertive. They tend to be very self-protective. They tend to blame others. They're very difficult to influence under stress, very walled off, shut down. And they will become entitled and possibly quite reactive under relational stress. And the problem isn't a lack of guilt. Either at the time or maybe much after, externalisers will have moments of brief self-reflection, but they are not self-reflective. The problem is a lack of self-examination. They aren't resourced enough to be able to ask themselves, what did I do here that would produce the conditions for this response? Now, over time, internalisers can actually turn into externalisers if they essentially absorb too much of other people's distress, and this will produce burnout, shutdown. In my case, I get to the point where I can't absorb anything anymore, and then I just flee because I can't fix whatever it is. And as I say, internalisers will get to a point where they will become externalisers. And what I see in front of me with couples is essentially two people who are in like a withdraw pattern. And there may have been a pattern of pursue, withdraw, but the internaliser, who may be the fixer, the pursuer, the person who's always sort of initiating difficult conversations, will get to a point where they just don't want to anymore. And then they become walled off. And that's a very stuck pattern to get out of. So I hope that's given you some insight into a very rudimentary introduction for how people are sort of organised. There's a lot more to it than that, but it's a good place to begin. So have a think about what you tend to do. The thing about externalising is that often there is some partial interest in exploring the self, but the capacity is that until externalisers explore through a therapeutic relationship, and it doesn't have to be with a therapist, it just has to be a safe relationship. Therapist is ideal. Until they explore asking themselves better questions, they often aren't even aware. It's not conscious. They actually believe that the problem is outside of them, because the capacity to explore the problem as being within them actually produces such nervous system distress that it just kind of gets ejected from the system, and often quite violently. But yeah, Hope that's helped.